In the spring of 1922, on a remote farmstead in southern Germany, a family lived almost completely cut off from the outside world. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. It sat alone between the forests and fields of Bavaria, connected to the nearest village by a narrow dirt road. No neighbors, no passing traffic. Just the wind, the trees, and the sound of animals in their stalls. The family who lived there were not well liked. Andreas Gruber was the patriarch. Strict, controlling, deeply paranoid. He lived with his wife, their widowed daughter Victoria, her 2 young children, and a recently hired maid. Locals described the household as tense, closed off, secretive. But what no one realized at the time was that something had already begun happening at Hinterkaifeck, weeks before anyone would notice the bodies. In late March, Andreas Gruber told neighbors something strange. He said he had found footprints in the snow. They came from the forest, and they led directly to the farm. But there were no footprints leading away. Gruber searched the property. He found nothing else. No intruder, no explanation. A few days later, he noticed another detail. Items in the house seemed to move on their own. A newspaper appeared on the kitchen table, one that no one in the family had subscribed to. Keys went missing. Footsteps were heard in the attic. Gruber climbed up to investigate. He found no one. No sign of forced entry. Nothing disturbed. The sounds continued. At night, the family heard movement above them. Slow, deliberate steps across the attic floor. Gruber checked again. Still nothing. He didn't contact the police. Instead, he did what he always did. He locked the doors, loaded his weapon, and said nothing more. On March 31st, a new maid arrived at the farm. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She had been warned before accepting the job. The previous maid had quit suddenly, claiming the house was haunted. She said she couldn't stand the feeling of being watched. Maria arrived anyway. Within hours of stepping onto the property, she vanished into the same house where footsteps had already been heard, and was never seen alive again. That evening, something happened in the barn. Investigators would later reconstruct the scene, piece by piece. Someone lured the family members out one at a time, not all at once, not in panic, one by one. Each was killed with a blunt farming tool. There were no signs of a struggle loud enough to alert the others inside the house. Which meant one thing: they trusted whoever was calling them. Over the next several days, no one noticed. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney. Animals were fed. Meals were prepared. Someone was still alive on the farm, or someone was pretending to be. When neighbors finally grew concerned and went to check on the Gruber family, what they found inside the barn and the house would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in modern European history. And the most unsettling detail wasn't how the family died. It was what happened after. On April 4th, 1922, 4 days after the last confirmed contact with the family at Hinterkaifeck, concern finally overcame routine. The children hadn't appeared at school. Mail deliveries went unanswered. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but no one had been seen. 2 neighbors decided to walk the dirt road to the farm. As they approached, nothing looked disturbed. The house stood intact. The barn doors were closed. Livestock could be heard inside. At first glance, it looked normal. Then they opened the barn. Inside, partially covered with hay, they found the bodies. Andreas Gruber and his wife lay side by side. Nearby was their daughter, Victoria. Beside her, one of the children. All had been killed by the same weapon, a mattock, a heavy farming tool designed for chopping earth and roots. The blows were precise, repeated, deliberate. There was no sign of panic in the barn, no scattered tools, no overturned carts. Each victim appeared to have been struck where they stood, as if they had stepped forward willingly. The neighbors ran for help. When police arrived, the scene grew worse. Inside the farmhouse, they found the second child, alive for a time after the attack. Evidence suggested she had survived for hours, possibly longer, before dying alone in her bed. In a nearby room, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, lay dead. She had been killed the same way. 6 people. all murdered with a tool taken from their own farm. But the most unsettling details emerged only after investigators began to look closer. Food had been eaten in the house after the murders. Bread cut. Meat consumed. Plates used and cleaned. The cattle had been fed. The fires had been kept going. Someone had stayed, for days. Whoever committed the murders did not flee. They lived among the bodies. Police searched the property thoroughly. They found no signs of forced entry, no blood trails leading away from the farm, no weapon discarded in the forest. Instead, the murder weapon was discovered on the property itself, hidden in the attic. The same attic where footsteps had been heard weeks earlier. As news spread, villagers gathered outside the farm despite police orders. Some walked freely through the crime scene. Evidence was disturbed. Footprints overlapped. Items were moved. Even so, one conclusion became impossible to avoid. The killer knew the farm. They knew the routine. They knew how to move without being heard. They knew how to wait. Suspicion turned quickly toward the past. Rumors about the family resurfaced. Accusations of abuse, isolation, and long-held secrets. Victoria's husband had died in the war under unclear circumstances. Some whispered that he had never truly left. Others suspected neighbors, former employees, someone with a grievance. But no matter how many names surfaced, none fit one critical detail. No one could explain how the killer stayed hidden on the farm for days without being seen. Or why they would. The official investigation stalled almost immediately. Despite Germany's best efforts, no arrest was made. No suspect was charged. And as the years passed, one possibility became increasingly disturbing. The killer may not have escaped at all. They may have simply walked away, unnoticed, after living in the house beside their victims. And if that was true, then Hinterkaifeck wasn't just the site of a massacre. It was a place where someone waited patiently, committed violence without urgency, and left without consequence. In Part 3, investigators begin to ask the most unsettling question of all. What if the killer had been watching the family long before the first body fell? And what if they never really left? As investigators struggled to find a suspect, one detail from Hinterkaifeck refused to fade into the background. Someone had been on the farm before the murders. Weeks earlier, Andreas Gruber had told neighbors about the footprints in the snow. They came from the forest. They stopped at the farm. They did not leave. At the time, it sounded like paranoia. After the murders, it sounded like a warning. Investigators began re-examining everything that happened before March 31st. The missing keys. The unexplained newspaper. The footsteps in the attic. Gruber had searched the attic himself. He had found nothing. But the attic space at Hinterkaifeck was large, cluttered, and poorly lit. It contained hay, tools, and storage areas rarely disturbed. If someone wanted to remain hidden, it would have been possible. And that led to a chilling theory. What if the killer had already been living on the farm? Not breaking in, not sneaking around at night, waiting. If true, it explained almost everything. Why there was no forced entry. Why the victims responded calmly when called to the barn. Why the killer knew the routine so well. Why the animals were fed and the fires kept going. It would also explain why no one ever saw anyone arrive or leave. The killer didn't need to. They were already there. Suspicion turned toward people who had intimate knowledge of the property. Former farmhands, disgruntled workers, neighbors familiar with the layout. One name surfaced repeatedly: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighbor. He knew the family well. He had a complicated relationship with Victoria, the daughter. Some believed he may have been the father of her youngest child. When Schlittenbauer arrived at the farm after the bodies were discovered, his behavior raised eyebrows. He entered the house without hesitation. He appeared calm. He knew where things were. Later, he admitted to moving bodies, claiming he was checking for survivors. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murders, no bloodstains, no witnesses, no confession. He was questioned repeatedly over the years and consistently denied involvement. Other suspects came and went. A former soldier passing through the area, an escaped mental patient rumored to be nearby, criminal gangs blamed without proof. Each theory explained part of the case. None explained all of it. What continued to haunt investigators was the timeline. The murders likely occurred on the evening of March 31st. The killer stayed. They slept in the house. They ate the food. They moved freely between rooms. The bodies in the barn were partially covered with hay, as if hidden but not hurried. This wasn't a crime committed in panic. It was controlled. Years later, when the farmhouse was demolished, workers found something else that reignited old fears. Hidden spaces, narrow crawl areas, places where a person could remain unseen. Too late to matter legally. Too late to prove anything. The case went cold, not because investigators gave up, but because time erased what evidence remained. No DNA, no reliable fingerprints, no living witnesses, only patterns. And the patterns suggested patience. In part 4, the final chapter, we confront the most unsettling truth about Hinterkaifeck. Not who committed the murders, but why the case was never truly solved. And why it may never be. By the time the investigation into the murders at Hinterkaifeck reached its later stages, the case was already slipping beyond resolution. Not because there were no theories, but because there were too many, and none could be proven. German authorities reopened the case multiple times over the following decades. Each review brought renewed attention, new interpretations, and the same result. No charges, no trial, no closure. Every suspect suffered from the same problem: lack of evidence. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the most discussed name. His proximity, his familiarity with the farm, and his behavior after the discovery made him a natural focus. But suspicion is not proof. He was questioned repeatedly, publicly scrutinized, and lived the rest of his life under a cloud of accusation. Yet nothing concrete ever tied him to the murders. Other theories collapsed under scrutiny. A roaming killer left no trail. A vengeful neighbor left no witnesses. A hidden intruder left no trace of entry or escape. The crime scene itself had been compromised from the beginning. Villagers walked freely through the farm. Objects were moved. Bodies were touched. Footprints overlapped. By modern standards, the investigation was fatally flawed. And yet, even if every mistake were erased, one problem would remain. Whoever committed the murders understood time. They waited, they observed. They acted when they knew no interruption would come. They didn't rush to escape. They didn't panic. They stayed. That detail alone separates Hinterkaifeck from most violent crimes of its era. This was not a moment of rage. It was not impulsive. It was methodical. The farmhouse was demolished in 1923, barely a year after the murders. The land was cleared. New buildings rose nearby. The physical place disappeared. But the silence did not. What remains today are records filled with gaps, testimonies shaped by fear and rumor, and a crime that resists a single explanation. No confession was ever recorded. No weapon definitively matched to a hand. No motive proven beyond speculation. Only 6 lives ended, and a mystery that refuses to settle. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about Hinterkaifeck is this: the killer didn't need to escape under cover of darkness. They didn't need to vanish dramatically. They may have simply walked away, in daylight, blending back into ordinary life. And if that's true, then the real horror of Hinterkaifeck isn't that we don't know who did it. It's that someone could do this, patiently, quietly, and never be held accountable. The case remains officially unsolved, and after more than a century, it likely always will be.